Also, schism sounds better in a British accent, so
Schism.
we'll just have you say it. See? If you say things in a British accent, it just sounds cooler. I'm just over here. It's a schism.
It's the basis of my entire career.
Hi, I'm Emmy.
And I'm James.
And welcome back to the Bestiary Monster Manual A through Z. And James, what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about the Drow. Thousands and thousands of years ago, when the world was new and the realms were newly founded, there was a great schism in the peoples of the Elves, with those dedicated to higher ideals choosing to remain true to their ways set down by their creators, and others influenced by dark beings and selfishness and greed, going their own way. But before we get into the deep, literally, history of the Drow, there's a conversation going on in the present day that we feel that we should address and chat about briefly before we really get into the meat of this.
Yes. So, right now there is a lot of controversy happening about the Drow because back when they were originally made, it was a little bit less sensitive. We made our bad guys have dark skin, and it was a really nasty trope, and it's pervasive, obviously, because it's still a part of this particular culture today. And I know James and I just wanted to take a quick second and talk a little bit about what we see as some potential maybe fixes for it, how we like to see it addressed, some research we've done. Of course, we highly recommend looking at other creators, especially Black creators who've talked about this, and always make sure that when you are sitting down at a D&D table, you and your players are always kept safe.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly not sitting down today and saying that we are the definitive voice and deciding opinion on this matter. This is just what we think of this. And, you know, I think generally speaking, and 5th edition D&D is better at this. You know, the hobby and the community in general has consistently improved over the years with regards to these kinds of controversies. Not perfect by any means, but it's better than it was. And what is, I think, a better way of looking at things like this is that nobody is inherently good or evil. You are not born any certain way. You can be influenced to, you know, have certain moral leanings one way or another, or one of any of the multiple moral leanings, there aren't just two, by your society. And the question is, what is the character and culture that a person is introduced to from, you know, the time they're born through the years that they're being influenced by what is seen as right and wrong, and that is going to create the person that they are. Because again, this is the philosophy background I have coming out, but a person is really nothing more than what they do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think, again, when we're talking about Drow society itself, and of course we'll get into this a little bit, they're mainly helmed by a theocracy that worships a demon. And that, of course, means that growing up, you're influenced by a lot of evil things. And that means that maybe your life has had a more complicated leaning, that you see the world through that scope. But these are not creatures entirely of a divine nature. They aren't gods, which are more inherently good or evil or things like that. That's an entirely different long conversation. These are people, and they are complex. I know another thing that we see out there is the idea that elves are all pale-skinned and drow are all dark-skinned. And I know, and of course this is my privilege talking. When I first started playing D&D, when I just initially looked at it, I was like, oh, drow are purple. And I imagined that drow were multiple shades of purple and elves were multiple shades of other colors. I mean, you get moon elves are blue sometimes, but like they have
like a blue tint to their skin sometimes, yeah.
But to me, that can be played across spectrum. And so
like wood elves are described as being a kind of olivish brown kind of color.
And realistically, I do think that a table is as open as its imagination. I am imagining silver-skinned drow. I am imagining dark-skinned elves. And again, just keeping your table as safe and open as possible and just never assuming that anyone is anything by the way they look is always just a good and safe bet. So
Yeah,
just
generally good advice. And, ultimately, if you're indulging in, a world of fantasy and imagination and creativity where you are getting together with friends to, tell, amazing and wonderful stories together, why limit yourselves with, stereotyping? It's pointless. Like, if you come to the table saying, I want to play this person and they look like this, cool.
Yeah. It is a beautiful and open world. The whole idea of fantasy is that this is something we want to live out. I mean, I know that I am an adult who gets to, play pretend with my friends. And it's so awesome. We all get to tell a really beautiful and amazing story together. And I can't imagine ever wanting to limit it or hold it back just by like what I can imagine. I want it to be more and to have it to grow. And I know right now, Wizards of the Coast is coming out with Tasha's Cauldron. I'm forgetting all the name of the book because
Tasha's Cauldron of everything.
See, this is why we have James.
Thank
you, James, for being here.
At the time of recording, Tasha's Cauldron is not out, but one of the things that Wizards of the Coast is seeking to do, among many, with this new supplemental material, is address these questions of racialism within the systems of D&D, and that can only be a good thing, and we look forward to seeing what they have come up with, and we hope it's good.
I really do. I have really high hopes and honestly really high expectations. No matter what, I also know that the game is not Wizards of the Coast. The game is the people I sit down at a table with. So ultimately, just remember, be kind, be cool, have an open imagination. And on that note, let's talk about Lolth and the people who worship her.
Yeah. So
this is a hefty chonker.
Yeah. So this schism that I mentioned earlier, really came about through influences and promises made by demonic entities, things that are more inherently evil, promising power, being able to sort of worm their way into the minds of those who would listen, accessing their deepest and darkest desires. And the strongest of these was Lolth. And in the end, those elves whose descendants would become what we know today as the Drow decided to split from the rest of their kin in order to follow the Spider Queen herself.
Yes, and I know, as we've said before, we're not covering Mordenkainen's in this episode. We really would love to, and so one day we're probably going to come back and address this.
We'll get to it.
Bit more. We'll get there. We'll get there. It'll be big. It'll be a whole thing. But yeah, they're following Lolth, the Demon Lord. They're ruled by a theocracy. The people who rule Drow noble houses have a clerical inclination and follow Lolth. So that's a whole thing. I know. Having an entire society based around the worship of a demon, that's so fascinatingly cool. And
yeah,
I know I love working with people and characters and player characters and societies where you're like on the inside of a cult and you don't even know it.
Because that potential of just like mind-shattering self-realization is just too tempting.
I know, it's so much fun. But again, this is an entire society. This is a major geopolitical force within the worlds of D&D are the Drow and how they operate, especially in a lot of the big pre-written worlds. You're going to run into these guys having a bunch of force. So yeah, these guys are very dominating, very domineering. They generally believe that they should probably inherit the earth and that they are the best and they should rule everything. But I also know, again, with any society, you're as likely to fight these guys as to walk in and have to do something with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Often, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. and that can give rise to all kinds of different potential plot hooks and storylines and motivations for your party, your characters to be working with people that they might not otherwise. Drow are certainly intelligent. I mean, they are still elves. They are still very much defined by that kind of higher nature, even though it has been somewhat corrupted. To the extent that they no longer see themselves as, outcasts or exiles. They are the rightful rulers of all that they were once a part of. And there could be a way to maybe use that against them. There might be a way in which that is used against you. But, like many cults, you don't really realize you're in one often and see everybody aside from you as undeserving of everything they have and everything else really being rightfully yours.
And everything being rightfully theirs is, I think, really the running theme. The problem primarily being, of course, you brought this up, they don't really see themselves as outcasts anymore, but at one point they were sent to the Underdark. They live in that deep, dark, terrible thing underneath everybody else. They are, again, the Underdark. When I originally had a problem imagining this when I was first getting into D&D. I was like, oh, it's underground. No, it is so deep underground where things get weird, and that has definitely had an influence on the way that they operate, the way they live, the way they build things, their magic. I know we talked about this a little bit in Dwergar, that the Underdark is a magical place, and this has an influence on the way that you are.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that it's not just that you go underground and now you're in the Underdark, you are miles and miles and miles beneath the surface, to the extent that the Drow, the Durgar, many other societies that exist in this place have entire cities, entire civilizations built there. And in the case of the Drow, there is this kind of strangely elven influence that still remains, but that it's been changed and altered over time, both by the influence of their environment and by the magic contained within it. So it is this kind of strange corruption of what you might see in elven cities on the surface, which I think is a setting and a place in which to be either fighting these guys or doing sort of political business would be a just fascinating place to be.
Oh yes, I mean, this is DM world building fodder to a T. If you want to sit down and build out a Drow city, I mean, I would say the sky's the limit, but it's not. You're underground. But it really is in that way. I mean, there's so much intrigue you could build into this, looking at them in comparison to elves, especially if you've been in an elvish city and then you go to a Drow city. How are these things different? How are they the same? Finding the overlap of where these societies were together and then where they split, and how newer things are different. Oh gosh, it's so much fun. And these guys don't have a central ruler, at least within this particular lore. They're again more like city-states. There's going to be a ruler of that particular area, of that particular city. And their politics are nuts.
I mean, quite a lot of Drow society is based around like political maneuvering, cutthroat politics, the positioning, because the main power blocks within these Drow cities and societies are noble houses. Very much an aristocratic theocracy in terms of how the power structure works. And one of the main driving forces behind anybody of any kind of influence is going to be making sure that you and yours stay on top. There is going to be as much infighting and betrayal and scheming among Drow noble houses and against each other than there is against any kind of external threat. And interestingly, separate to a lot of societies as presented in most D&D settings, Drow society is strictly matriarchal. Women are on top.
Yes. In this particular instance, only women can ascend to be full clerics of Lolth, which is how you gain power. I know we'll probably learn a little bit about this more in Mordenkainen's, but I don't know why I think that's such a hilariously weird thing. But yeah, no dudes allowed in the church.
I mean,
But yeah.
doubtless some kind of influence from Lolth being the queen of spiders herself.
Absolutely, that's why.
But why exactly is something I'm not particularly familiar with. I mean, if you're watching this and you know, then I would love to hear about it in the comments. We've not really addressed the spider thing yet, actually, have we?
We really haven't. We haven't. We've walked right past the elephant in the room, which is a spider in this particular instance.
Oh god, an elephant-sized spider.
That's basically what we're talking about in this particular instance. Just Lolth is the demon spider queen. She's got a spider motif. That's a thing you're going to see in a lot of the art. A lot of the armor is designed out of adamantine, and it's going to have webs and spiders. And you're probably going to see this, much like any religious city, you're going to see the religious motif carried across most all of the architecture, and they are pretty obsessed with it. So here in the book we've got this beautiful picture of this one drow, just what I'm assuming is a temple with all these spider webs that are not spider webs, they're adamantine architecture webbing that's just spanned across the back. It's so cool.
Personally, what I actually love about that image in particular is almost like the lack of detail you see in the faces, how it's very, not exactly monotone or monochrome, but that sort of dark, purplish gray color is in everything from the stone to the architecture you can see around them to, their skin tones, and then that brilliant contrast of just shock white hair. I think it's an eerily pretty image that I have a lot of time for.
I love, one of my favorite things about it is the white in the background, that there's these almost what look like fungus sorts of light almost, that there's this bioluminescence in the background lighting up the Underdark. It's just beautiful. And again, going back to, these are elves. Elves have beautiful senses of construction and city building, and everything they build is, even though these guys worship a demon, and she's a straight up demon, I cannot emphasize this enough, she is a straight up demon with her own chamber in the abyss. Everything they build, they have the time and patience to detail to build these glorious, beautiful things. And I imagine even if you're there and you're probably imprisoned by them, it's gonna be real stinking pretty.
Yeah, I mean, again, coming down to, not the essentialism of them as a people, but the nature of their society, they may be cruel and malicious and arrogant, but they are still kind of beautiful in their own way.
Oh yeah. And I mean, again, when we're talking about this being a cult, the cult of Lolth and this entire society, you're going to, again, if you're walking around through a drow city for whatever reason and interacting with these guys, you're going to get so many variations. I know when we're looking at the stat blocks here, the suggestions going across the way are neutral evil. And again, these stat blocks are going to be people you're fighting, so these are probably people who are dedicated to Lolth, and we straight up have a drow priestess of Lolth. That makes a sense if you've dedicated your life from A to Z and you've never looked outside of it, to a demon lord. That tracks, that makes sense. But if you're walking through the strata of society, you're gonna get so many interesting people influenced by this world. The world building is so big and so huge. It's so much fun.
Yeah, I mean, even just the potential to explore, okay, so how does this infighting and subterfuge between drow noble houses work? Like, that question alone, I think you could spend hours of time, exploring, with your players, and just really, getting your teeth into the meat of this society.
I know, looking at the book, the way they talk about, they have like a predilection for poison and poisoning their enemies and poisoning their blades and underdealing and backstabbing. And all I could think about was Italian families in the Renaissance. Just like, that's all I could think about was just like
Yeah.
this extreme need for the show of power. And with these guys, very much the idea of power is also, how big is your house? How many paintings do you have? Like there's absolutely that sense of being able to show your power as well, and how close you can get to Lolth. And oh man, and I keep thinking about like the noble house. Like, I don't know, I keep imagining, especially since we're looking at a matriarchal rule with like the main man of the house and the main woman of the house, or like how those politics work. And oh man, there's again, we could make an entire episode where James and I just build a Drow city and we just riff off of each other, and we could talk about that for hours. These guys could go on and on and on.
Yeah, I mean, it's some of the most compelling stuff in fantasy. Like when you've got the battles and the monsters, but then you look at stuff like the popularity of things like Game of Thrones, where the whole thing was just different groups of rival families struggling against each other. And obviously that itself was rooted in reality. It was inspired by the English Wars of the Roses. And yeah, I personally would love to, when I get the time, design like a campaign based around just the political machinations of groups of Drow nobles.
It's just so cool. It's so cool. And there's again, like, so many places that you can take this and go. This is an extreme template. Like, basically this book is going to give you like a few hits of like, they have Drow magic, they're adapted to underground life, their magic is very much based on that. You've got a lot of like fairy fire and things like that, and magic that seeps in from the abyss as well.
The ability to summon a demon.
Oh yeah, that's right. A lot of their higher guys could just summon a demon once a day just for funsies. But there's also, and this is something, I mean, I will say primarily my experience with D&D has been 5e. I used to play a little bit of 3.5. So again, please tell us your stories about previous editions of the game down in the comments. We eat that stuff up here. But for me and the experiences in D&D I've played dungeon crawls, but I've also, especially in the last few years, really had a lot of experience playing D&D games where we won't have combat for a couple of weeks because we're talking to people. We're having to deal with a whole bunch of other things. And there's so many stat blocks for that in your character sheet. And it really does make you want to delve into this world and dig deep, literally, into the world of the Drow.
Thank you again for joining us here at the Bestiary Monster Manual A to Z. What have been your experiences with this subterranean society? Delve deep into the comments and let us know. We'd sure like to hear from you. While you're there, you can subscribe to the Adventurers Pack if you haven't already. You can like this video, hit that bell to be notified when we release new content. Speaking of which, you can find more content here. And you can join us next week where we talk about the Children of the Gods, the Empyreans.